911 Sheriff's Department.
I'm at the Circle K at Orange Oracle in Orange Grove.
Okay, what
I need
happened?
an ambulance.
Okay.
And the police right away.
Okay, what happened, sir?
My wife was missing all night. I just found her in the back of Circle K.
Okay.
She may be dead.
Behind Circle K, sir?
Yeah.
Okay. And you're in a call right now?
I'm on a payphone.
Okay, what's your name?
Scott Knight.
The voice you just heard belongs to the husband of Nola Jean Knight. On December 22, 1990, he found his wife behind a Circle K convenience store in Tucson, Arizona. Nola was dead. She had been brutally attacked, and her husband was the person who found her. I have listened to a lot of 911 calls while researching cases for this channel, but there is something especially difficult about listening to a person realize that the person they love is gone. And what makes this call even more disturbing is knowing what would happen next, because Nola Jean Knight was not the last woman whose life would become connected to a man named Robert Lee Walden. Over the months that followed, women in Tucson would be attacked in apartment complexes and inside their own homes. 2 women would survive and later sit in a courtroom and identify the man they said attacked them. Another woman would be found murdered inside her bedroom. Investigators would eventually find Walden's fingerprints at 2 separate crime scenes, and when police confronted him about one of those fingerprints, Walden had a problem. He told investigators that he had never been inside that apartment. He could not explain why his fingerprint was there. But even after his arrest, conviction, and death sentence, there was still more. Walden would later plead guilty to Nola Jean Knight's murder. He would also confess to the murder of another woman, Denene Brevaire-Domet, a case prosecutors agreed not to charge him with in exchange for his confession. This is the case of Robert Lee Walden, and the story begins with a 911 call from a husband who had just found his wife. Hi everyone, welcome back to GORI Explorations. My name is Ashley. Before we get into this case, I want to be clear about something. This story involves sexual violence and murder. I'm not going to include unnecessary graphic details, but some of the information is disturbing. I also want to explain that this case is a little different from some of the others I've covered. Robert Lee Walden was not convicted in one single case involving all of the women we are going to talk about today. There are important legal distinctions between them. He was convicted of the crimes against Vicki Blanar and Kristina Velasco, and of the murder of Miguela Burhans. Those cases were tried together and he was convicted on all 14 counts. He later pleaded guilty to the murder of Nola Jean Knight and received a life sentence. And he confessed to killing Denene Brevaire-Domet, but he was not prosecuted for her murder because prosecutors had agreed not to charge him in exchange for that confession. I'm making those distinctions now because I think they matter. When we talk about true crime cases, words like convicted, pleaded guilty, confessed, and suspected are not interchangeable. So throughout this video, I'm going to be very clear about what Robert Lee Walden was convicted of, what he admitted to, and what the records actually say. On December 22, 1990, Nola Jean Knight's husband made the 911 call you heard at the beginning of this video. He had found his wife behind a convenience store in the 6400 block of North Oracle Road in Tucson. There are details about Nola's final hours that appear in secondary sources, but I have not been able to verify every one of those details through the stronger court and news records I have. So I'm not going to fill in the gaps. What we know is devastating enough. Nola was killed. Her husband found her. And years later, Robert Lee Walden pleaded guilty to her murder. But at the time Nola was killed, the crimes that would ultimately lead police directly to Walden had not happened yet. And just weeks after Nola's death, another woman would be murdered. Her name was Denene Brevaire-Domet. Denene worked as a secretary for a construction company in Midtown Tucson. In February of 1991, she was found dead inside the office where she worked. Her body was found lying in a pool of blood. At the time, Denene's murder was unsolved, and this is where the timeline becomes important. Nola had been killed in December. Denene was killed in February. Then in May of 1991, women began surviving encounters with a man who would eventually be connected to both of their murders. Years later, Robert Lee Walden confessed to killing Denene. But he was never prosecuted for her murder. According to later reporting, prosecutors had agreed not to charge him in exchange for his confession. They said they hoped learning what had happened would bring some comfort to Denene's family. I have mixed feelings about that. I understand wanting answers for a family. I understand why knowing who killed your loved one can matter. But I also can't imagine being told that the person who confessed to killing someone you love will never actually be prosecuted for taking their life. By this point, Walden had already been sentenced to death in another case. But Denene still mattered. Her life mattered. And I think it's important that she is not reduced to a footnote in the story of the man who confessed to killing her. Then came May 4th, 1991, and this time, the woman survived. That morning, Vicki Blanar went to an apartment complex in Tucson to meet a friend. When she arrived, she noticed a man standing near the swimming pool. That man was Robert Lee Walden. Vicki knocked on her friend's door, but no one answered, so she returned to her car and waited. A few minutes later, she tried again. Still, there was no answer. As Vicki turned to leave, Walden came up behind her. He put a knife against her throat, and he threatened to kill her if she did not go with him. Walden forced Vicki into the apartment complex's community laundry room. Once inside, he ordered her to remove her clothing. She refused. He gave her another sexual command. Again, she refused. Walden then forcibly removed her clothing and sexually assaulted her while holding the knife against her neck. Afterward, he left the laundry room. But before he did, he told Vicki that if she left, he would come back and kill her. Then he returned. And then he left again. And returned again. I want you to think about the terror of that moment. Vicki had just survived an attack. She had been threatened with a knife, and even when her attacker walked out of the room, she could not know if it was actually over, because he kept coming back. The third time Walden left, Vicki ran. She made it to her car, drove home, and told her boyfriend that she had been raped. She was taken to the emergency room for an examination and treatment. Testing of evidence recovered from her clothing could not exclude Walden as the attacker. But Vicki's identification of Walden is also important. Over the following weeks, police showed her numerous photographic lineups. She did not simply pick someone. In fact, Vicki looked at 13 different lineups without identifying anyone. It was in the 14th lineup that she identified Robert Lee Walden. She later identified him again in court. I think that detail matters because Walden's defense would later argue that the women were mistaken. But Vicki had already shown investigators that she was willing to look at a lineup and say essentially, no, that is not him. Again and again and again. 13 times. Then she saw Walden, and she identified him. According to the court record, the attack lasted approximately 15 minutes. It happened during daylight, and Vicki had several opportunities to see her attacker's uncovered face. At this point, police had a woman who had survived a terrifying attack, but they did not yet know what was coming. Because just 11 days later, another woman would be attacked, and this time the attacker would not be waiting near a swimming pool. He would knock on a woman's front door wearing a work uniform, and he would convince her to let him inside. On May 15, 1991, Robert Lee Walden knocked on Kristina Velasco's door. He was wearing blue pants and a red shirt, the work uniform of the pest control company that employed him. Walden told Kristina that he was there to work on her plumbing, and Kristina had a reason to believe him. She thought her pipes were leaking, so she let him inside. Once Walden was in the apartment, he asked Kristina to go upstairs with him. That made her suspicious. Kristina reached for the telephone to call a friend. Walden grabbed her from behind. He threatened to kill her if she screamed. Then he took the telephone from her hands and tried to wrap the cord around her neck. Kristina fought back. The phone fell. Walden dragged her into the downstairs bathroom and grabbed a hairdryer. Then he tried to use that cord around her neck too. Again, he was unsuccessful. Kristina continued to fight. At one point, she almost made it out of the apartment, but Walden caught her. He kicked the door closed and he dragged her upstairs. As he did, he threatened to kill her. This is where I have to stop for a moment and say something. The more I researched this case, the more I kept thinking about how hard Kristina fought. She became suspicious. She tried to call someone. She fought when he attacked her. She nearly escaped. She survived 2 attempts to put cords around her neck. None of that means that a victim who cannot fight back has done anything wrong. But in Kristina's story, her resistance is part of what happened, and she survived. Walden forced Kristina to kneel on the bedroom floor. He tied her arms behind her back with a telephone cord. He blindfolded her, he gagged her, and he sexually assaulted her. Afterward, Kristina managed to loosen the restraints around her hands, but Walden realized what she had done. He tied her hands again and then bound her feet. He told Kristina that he knew everything about her, and he threatened to kill her if she reported what had happened. Then Kristina heard him downstairs. She could hear keys jingling. Walden eventually returned to the bedroom and ran an object down her back. He told her it was a knife, and again, he threatened her. Then Kristina heard the front door open and close. She may have believed he was finally gone, but he wasn't. Walden came back into the room. He laughed, and he let Kristina know that he was still watching her. I cannot imagine what that moment must have been like, because it wasn't enough for him to attack her. It wasn't enough to threaten her life. It appears that he wanted her to believe she was alone, and then wanted her to know that she wasn't. Eventually, Walden did leave. Kristina freed herself, got dressed, and ran to the apartment manager's office for help. She was taken to an emergency room where injuries were documented on her face, back, and wrist. But this time, the attacker had left something behind. 2 fingerprints were found on the tennis shoes Kristina had been wearing. Those fingerprints matched Robert Lee Walden. Kristina would also identify Walden. And like Vicki, she had opportunities to see the man who attacked her. She had seen him when he first came to her door in daylight. She had been close to him inside the apartment, and during the attack, she had seen his face reflected in mirrors. There were other details she remembered too: the red shirt, the blue pants, the keys, and a beeper. That beeper would later become an issue at trial. The defense questioned when Kristina had first told police that her attacker had one, so prosecutors played part of the 911 call made after her attack to show the jury that the beeper had been mentioned during the initial call. At this point, 2 women had survived, but police had not arrested Walden. Not yet. Then less than 1 month later, another woman was attacked. This time, she did not survive. On June 13, 1991, Miguela Burhans was home alone in her apartment in Tucson. Her apartment complex was next to the one where Kristina had been attacked, and Robert Lee Walden lived within blocks of the area. At approximately 1:30 that afternoon, a woman named Elaine Jordan saw Walden at Miguela's apartment complex. He was wearing a uniform and carrying equipment. Elaine assumed he was a maintenance worker. Miguela was also seen heading toward the apartment complex at around the same time. Then sometime between approximately 1:30 and 2:30 that afternoon, Miguela was attacked inside her own bedroom. Shortly after 2:30, Miguela's husband came home from work. The apartment door was open. He went inside, and in the bedroom, he found his wife. Miguela had been sexually assaulted and killed. She had been strangled. A clay lamp had been broken during the attack, scattering pieces through the bedroom. The lamp's electrical cord had been used to strangle her. The evidence showed that Miguela fought for her life. I'm intentionally not going to describe every injury in this video. The court records contain more graphic detail than I think is necessary to tell you what happened, but there is one thing that is important to understanding this case. The courts later concluded that Miguela remained conscious during at least part of the attack. She knew what was happening, and she struggled to survive. That became an important part of the decision to sentence Walden to death. Miguela was 31 years old, and her husband was the person who found her. We started this story with another husband making a 911 call after finding his wife. Now, less than 6 months after Nola Jean Knight was killed, another husband had come home to a nightmare. And Miguela's husband would also call 911. We do not have that recording, but years later it would be played for a jury. The defense questioned his memory of the day his wife was killed, specifically why he had not mentioned certain visitors from the night before during his first police interview. Prosecutors played his 911 call to show the condition he was in immediately after finding Miguela. He was in shock. He was grieving, and the jury was allowed to hear that for themselves. Investigators processed the apartment, and inside the bedroom they found a fingerprint. It was on the nightstand. That fingerprint belonged to Robert Lee Walden. Elaine Jordan had also seen him at the apartment complex around the time Miguela was killed. She remembered a man who appeared to be a maintenance worker and was carrying equipment. And after Walden was arrested, investigators asked him about Miguela's apartment. Walden said he had never been inside. He could not explain why his fingerprint was there. And that is a serious problem for him, because if Walden had said he had once performed pest control work inside the apartment, investigators would have had to examine that explanation. If he had said he knew Miguela or her husband, they would have had to investigate that. But according to the court record, Walden said he had never been inside the apartment at all, yet his fingerprint was in her bedroom. By this point, investigators had evidence from 3 attacks committed during a period of approximately 6 weeks. Vicki had survived. Kristina had survived. Miguela had not. Both surviving women would identify Walden. An eyewitness placed him near Miguela's apartment around the time she was killed, and his fingerprints connected him to both Kristina's and Miguela's crime scenes. The evidence in each case was separate, but taken together, investigators were beginning to see the same man, Robert Lee Walden. In late June of 1991, police went to his apartment, and the man who had been moving through Tucson in a pest control uniform was about to be arrested. Police went to Walden's apartment without an arrest warrant. When he answered the door, police asked if they could speak with him. He stepped outside and walked with officers around to the side of the apartment building. That is when police told Robert Lee Walden that he was under arrest for the May 15th attack on Kristina Velasco. Officers read him his rights. According to the court record, Walden said that he understood them, and he agreed to speak with investigators without an attorney present. The questions did not stay focused on Kristina. Investigators also wanted to know about Miguela Burhans. And that is when they confronted Walden with the fingerprint found inside her bedroom. His answer was the one we just talked about. He said he had never been inside Miguela's apartment. That statement would later be used against him at trial. Walden's attorneys tried to have his post-arrest statements thrown out. They argued that police had arrested him illegally because officers did not have a warrant when they went to his apartment, but the courts rejected that argument. The arrest happened outside the apartment, and the court found that investigators had probable cause to take him into custody. After Walden's arrest, Kristina identified him from a 6-person photographic lineup. She would later identify him again in court. And Elaine Jordan, the woman who had seen a man who appeared to be a maintenance worker at Miguela's apartment complex, also connected Walden to what she had seen. Her identification became more complicated, and I think it is important to explain that instead of making the evidence sound cleaner than it actually was. When Elaine first looked at the lineup, another photograph caught her attention because she thought that man looked similar to the person she remembered. But she continued looking. Then she said that she had definitely seen Robert Lee Walden at the apartment complex. There had also been a brief moment when the recording of the lineup procedure was turned off. The defense later argued that something improper could have happened during that off-the-record conversation, but the detective explained what had occurred, turned the recorder back on, and documented it. The courts ultimately found that police had not improperly influenced Elaine's identification, and this would become a major part of Walden's defense, because Robert Lee Walden's position was that the witnesses were wrong. In July of 1991, Walden was indicted on 14 charges involving Vicki Blanar, Kristina Velasco, and Miguela Burhans. The prosecution decided to try all 3 cases together. The charges included kidnapping, aggravated assault, sexual abuse, sexual assault, burglary, robbery, and first-degree murder. Walden's attorneys fought to separate the cases. They argued that trying all 3 together would be unfair. Think about the concern from the defense perspective. A jury hearing only Vicki's case would hear the evidence involving Vicki. A jury hearing only Kristina's case would hear the evidence involving Kristina. And a jury hearing only Miguela's murder case would hear the evidence from Miguela's apartment. But if all 3 were tried together, the same jury would hear everything. Walden argued that would make it impossible for jurors to judge each case independently. The judge disagreed. The cases were tried together, and the jury was specifically instructed that each charge had to be decided based on the evidence that applied to that charge. This decision would become one of the issues Walden continued to challenge for decades after his conviction. But first, he had to face the jury. Walden's defense can be summed up in 2 words: alibi and misidentification. He said essentially that he was not the man who committed these crimes. At trial, his attorney called 7 witnesses in an effort to establish that Walden had an alibi for each incident. The defense also called an expert to testify about the fallibility of human memory and perception. And I want to be fair here. Eyewitness identification can be wrong. Human memory is not a video recording. People can make mistakes, and I think it is completely reasonable for a defense attorney to challenge eyewitness testimony, especially in a case where someone's life is at stake. But the problem for Walden was that this case did not depend on one person getting one look at a stranger. Vicki identified him. Kristina identified him. Elaine placed him near Miguela's apartment, and there was physical evidence connecting him to both Kristina's and Miguela's crime scenes. So if Walden wanted the jury to believe that the witnesses were mistaken, he also had to overcome the physical evidence. The full testimony from all 7 alibi witnesses is not included in the appellate records I have, so I'm not going to pretend that I can reconstruct every minute of Walden's claimed whereabouts. But the court records give us an important clue about how at least part of the defense worked. Walden's job required him to travel between locations. The defense appears to have relied partly on his work schedule and witnesses to argue that he was somewhere else around the times the crimes occurred. So the question became, could Walden have traveled between the locations quickly enough to commit a crime and still appear where his work schedule or witnesses placed him? The prosecution introduced evidence that Walden's employer had previously spoken to him about speeding. In other words, the prosecution was challenging the idea that the timeline made it impossible for Walden to be the attacker. Walden's defense asked the judge to tell the jury not to assume that because he had been accused of speeding before, he must have been speeding on the days of the crimes. The judge refused to give that instruction. Walden's attorneys also wanted the jury to hear about sexual assaults that happened in Tucson after Walden was already in police custody. The argument was easy to understand. If similar crimes were still happening while Walden was locked up, perhaps someone else had committed the attacks blamed on him. At least one of those later attacks did have some surface similarities to Vicki's case. It happened in an apartment complex laundry room. The attacker approached from behind, and a knife was involved. But there was a major problem with using that crime to help Walden. The victim described an attacker who looked very different from him. Police arrested a man matching her description that same day, and that man confessed. The judge excluded the evidence. The jury would not hear about that attack. Walden's attorneys attacked the 6-person photo lineup. They argued that the other men did not resemble Walden closely enough and that his photograph stood out. They also argued that Vicki and Kristina's later courtroom identifications had been tainted after they were told the person they selected was in custody. The trial judge rejected those arguments. The judge found that the photographs had been responsibly selected. The defense wanted the jury to believe that the witnesses were mistaken and that the physical evidence did not mean what prosecutors said it meant. The jury had to decide. On July 31, 1992, the jury returned its verdict. Robert Lee Walden was found guilty on all 14 counts. The convictions involved the crimes against all 3 women: Vicki Blanar, Kristina Velasco, and Miguela Burhans. The jury convicted Walden of kidnapping, aggravated assault, sexual abuse, sexual assault, burglary, robbery, and first-degree murder. The murder verdict requires a little explanation. The jury convicted Walden of first-degree murder under a felony murder theory. The records indicate that the jurors were divided on whether the murder was also premeditated. That does not mean they were divided on whether Walden was responsible for Miguela's death. They convicted him of her murder. The question was the legal theory underlying that conviction. The jury had heard the prosecution's evidence. They had heard the defense witnesses. They had heard the expert testimony about memory, and according to contemporary reporting, they reached their verdict in less than a day. All 14 counts, guilty. But the jury would not decide whether Walden lived or died. At that time in Arizona, that decision belonged to the judge. By the time Walden stood before that judge, the court was not looking at a man with no previous history of violence. He had already been convicted of aggravated assault in 1990. He had also been on probation when he committed the crimes against Vicki Blanar, Kristina Velasco, and Miguela Burhans. And shortly before he was sentenced in this case, he had been convicted in a separate sexual assault case. The court considered Walden's other serious and violent convictions as part of the decision over whether he should receive the death penalty. And I think this is where a question becomes impossible to ignore. How was Robert Lee Walden on probation while committing these crimes? This was a man who had already been convicted of violence, yet in the spring and summer of 1991, he was working for a pest control company. His job took him to residential homes and apartment complexes throughout Tucson. He wore a uniform, he carried equipment, and that uniform gave him the appearance of someone who belonged there. That matters. Kristina opened her door because Walden told her he was there to do maintenance work. Elaine Jordan saw him at Miguela's apartment complex and assumed he was a maintenance worker. The very thing that made him look legitimate may have helped him get close to women. And I have to wonder how differently this story might have ended if someone had recognized the danger sooner. Because by the time Walden was arrested, Vicki had been attacked. Kristina had been attacked. Miguela was dead. Nola Jean Knight was dead. And Denene Brevaire-Domet was dead. We know now how those cases would eventually connect to Walden. But at the time of his sentencing, the judge had to decide the punishment for Miguela's murder. The prosecution argued that the circumstances of Miguela's murder justified a death sentence. The judge agreed. The court found multiple aggravating circumstances. One of the most important involved the suffering Miguela experienced before she died. I am not going to describe every injury. I don't think I need to. And I don't think Miguela should be remembered only through the most graphic details of what was done to her. What matters legally is that the court concluded she remained conscious during at least part of the attack. She struggled. She fought for her life, and the court found that she experienced significant physical and mental suffering before she died. That was part of the reason her murder was found to be especially cruel. The question then became whether there was anything about Walden's life that was strong enough to outweigh the aggravating factors. Walden's attorneys presented evidence about his life. They told the court that he had participated in organized sports, that he had been a good athlete, that he had coached Little League, that he had received good grades during 2 years of high school. Family members and friends spoke highly of him. The court also heard about his military service. Walden had served in the military before receiving a general discharge after an incident involving a bad check. His defense wanted the judge to see more than the crimes. They wanted the court to see a person who had family and friends who cared about him, a person who had once coached children, a person who had been an athlete, a person whose life, they argued, still had value. And I think this is another part of true crime that can be uncomfortable to talk about. People who commit horrific crimes do not always spend every moment of their lives appearing horrific to everyone around them. Sometimes they have friends. Sometimes they have families. Sometimes they coach children. Sometimes there are people who can stand in a courtroom and tell a judge about the good things they once did. But the judge had to weigh those things against what Robert Lee Walden had done. The court considered the mitigation and found that it was not enough. During the sentencing proceedings, the prosecutor called Walden the most dangerous man in Tucson. Walden would later argue that the statement was improper. The Arizona Supreme Court rejected that claim. On December 9, 1992, Robert Lee Walden was sentenced to death for the murder of Miguela Burhans. He also received prison sentences for the remaining convictions. But even then, this story was not over, because Robert Lee Walden had not yet been held responsible for Nola Jean Knight's murder, and Denene Brevaire-Domet's family still did not know who had killed her. Remember the 911 call at the beginning of this video? Nola Jean Knight's husband had found his wife behind a convenience store in December of 1990. Her murder happened months before the attacks on Vicki, Kristina, and Miguela. And for a time, her case remained unsolved. But after Walden's conviction and death sentence, another part of the story came into focus. Robert Lee Walden pleaded guilty to murdering Nola Jean Knight. He was sentenced to life in prison for her murder. And I keep thinking about the fact that Nola's husband was the one who found her. He made that 911 call. He was there at the beginning of this story, but the answer to who killed his wife would not come until later. The man responsible was already sitting on death row for the murder of another woman. After Walden was sentenced to death, another murder came back into the story. Denene Brevaire-Domet, the secretary who had been found murdered inside the construction company office where she worked. Robert Lee Walden confessed to killing her. But this case was different. He was not charged. According to later reporting, prosecutors had agreed not to prosecute Walden for Denene's murder in exchange for his confession. They said they hoped that knowing what happened would bring some comfort to her family. Walden was convicted of murdering Miguela Burhans. He pleaded guilty to murdering Nola Jean Knight, and he confessed to murdering Denene Brevaire-Domet, but was not prosecuted for her death. 3 different legal situations, all connected to the same man. And I have to wonder, if Walden had not been arrested in June of 1991, would there have been another woman? And another? We cannot know. But what we do know is that the attacks against Vicki, Kristina, and Miguela occurred over a period of only about 6 weeks. The violence was not years apart, it was happening quickly. A death sentence does not mean an execution happens immediately, and in Walden's case, the legal battle would continue for decades. He challenged the decision to try the 3 cases together. He challenged the photo identifications. He challenged evidence admitted at trial. He challenged the effectiveness of his attorneys. And again, courts reviewed the case. In 2021, nearly 30 years after Walden was sentenced to death, a federal appeals court again rejected his attempt to overturn the outcome of the case. 3 decades. Think about that. Vicki and Kristina survived their attacks in 1991. Miguela was murdered in 1991. Walden was convicted in 1992. And the legal fight was still continuing nearly 30 years later. After spending so much time reading court opinions, appeals, motions, and legal arguments, I keep coming back to something. Robert Lee Walden's name appears everywhere. His name is on the court cases, his name is on the appeals, his arguments were reviewed for decades. But this story did not begin with Robert Lee Walden. It began with the women whose lives he entered. Nola Jean Knight was killed in December of 1990. Her husband found her behind a convenience store and made the 911 call you heard at the beginning of this video. Denene Brevaire-Domet went to work. She was killed inside the office where she worked as a secretary. Vicki Blanar went to visit a friend. She knocked on a door, no one answered, and a man she had noticed near the swimming pool attacked her as she walked away. She survived. Kristina Velasco was inside her own home when a man in a work uniform knocked on her door. She believed he was there to do a job. She let him inside. She survived. And Miguela Burhans was at home in the middle of the afternoon. Her husband came home from work and found her. She did not survive. 5 women. 3 of them were killed. 2 of them survived. And the 2 women who survived had to walk into a courtroom and face the man they said attacked them. They had to tell strangers what happened. They had to be questioned. Their memories were challenged. Their identifications were challenged. And Robert Lee Walden's legal team had every right to do that. That is how our justice system is supposed to work. The prosecution has to prove its case. The defense has the right to challenge the evidence. But I think it is also important to recognize what that process asks of survivors. Vicki and Kristina survived the attacks. Then they had to survive telling the story. There are several things about this case that I cannot stop thinking about. The first is the speed. The attacks on Vicki, Kristina, and Miguela happened within approximately 6 weeks. 11 days separated Vicki's attack from Kristina's. Less than a month after Kristina survived, Miguela was killed. That is not a slow timeline, and it makes me wonder what would have happened if Walden had not been arrested when he was. We will never know. The second thing is the uniform. Robert Lee Walden worked for a pest control company. He wore blue pants and a red shirt. He carried equipment. He looked like someone who belonged in an apartment complex. Kristina let him into her home because he told her he was there to work on her plumbing. Elaine saw him near Miguela's apartment and assumed he was a maintenance worker. A uniform can create trust. It can make someone look official. It can make a stranger seem less threatening. And in this case, I think that is terrifying. And as a woman, I do think there are reasonable steps we can take to protect ourselves. Not because the responsibility for violence ever belongs to the victim. It doesn't. But because people can use trust, uniforms, job titles, and the appearance of authority to make us lower our guard. Kristina had a reason to believe Walden. She thought her pipes were leaking and he showed up wearing a work uniform. Elaine saw him carrying equipment and assumed he belonged at the apartment complex. I think one lesson I'm taking from this case is that it is okay to verify who someone is before letting them into your home. If you are not expecting a worker, you can keep the door locked and call the company, your landlord, or your property manager yourself. Use a number you already have or look up independently, not one the person standing at your door gives you. You do not have to open your door just because someone knocks. You do not have to worry about seeming rude. And if something feels wrong, you are allowed to listen to that feeling. I also think it is worth having a plan before you ever need one. Know who you will call. Keep your phone accessible when you can. And talk to the women and girls in your life about the fact that someone looking official does not automatically mean they are safe. None of these things can guarantee that a person will never become a victim. The responsibility always belongs to the person who chooses to hurt someone. But as a woman and as a mom, I do believe there is value in talking openly about ways we can look out for ourselves and each other. And the third thing I keep thinking about is the fingerprint in Miguela's bedroom. Walden said he had never been inside her apartment. Not that he had worked there before, not that he knew someone who lived there, not that he had a reason to be there. He said he had never been inside, but his fingerprint was there. I want to come back to where we started. Nola Jean Knight's husband. I chose to begin this video with his 911 call because court records can make a case feel distant. A court opinion can say that a body was found. It can list evidence. It can explain a legal argument. But a 911 call reminds us that before there was a court case, there was a person. There was a husband looking for his wife. And then there was a moment when his entire life changed.
My wife was missing all night. I just found her in the back of Circle K. Okay, she may be dead. Behind.
When you hear that call, Walden is not the most important person in the story. Nola is. Her husband is. The life that was taken is. And I think that is where I want to leave this case. I have covered cases where the evidence depends heavily on one witness. This was not one of those cases. The prosecution had 2 surviving women who identified Walden. They had an eyewitness who placed him near Miguela's apartment complex and around the time she was killed. They had fingerprint evidence connected to 2 separate crime scenes, and they had Walden's own statement that he had never been inside Miguela's apartment. The defense challenged the identifications. They presented alibi witnesses. They brought in an expert to explain the problems that can exist with human memory, and the jury heard that evidence. And they convicted Robert Lee Walden on all 14 counts. But I do have questions. I want to know more about the fact that Walden was on probation when these crimes happened. I want to know what supervision looked like. I want to know how much his employer knew about his past. And I want to know whether anything could have been done differently before more women were hurt. I don't have enough verified information to answer those questions, so I'm not going to pretend that I do. But I think they are fair questions to ask. I want to know what you think. What part of this case stands out to you the most? Is it the speed at which the attacks happened? The way Walden used the appearance of a worker to gain trust? The eyewitness identifications? Or the fingerprint found inside Miguela's bedroom after Walden said he had never been there? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And as always, please keep the conversation respectful to the victims, the survivors, and their families. If you found this video informative, please consider liking it and subscribing to GORI Explorations. It really does help my channel, and it helps me continue researching and telling these cases in a way that focuses on the people at the center of them. Thank you for watching. I'm Ashley, and this is GORI Explorations.